Hey there, today we're talking about cursed twists, both square and triangle, and exploring some of the situations where they're needed. So, hi, I'm Madonna here from Gathering Folds, and let's dive into the twists themselves. So, anytime we have a twist, the twist is defined by the way the pleats come into it. And there may be some modifications on top of that, but in general, when I'm looking at twists, I'm looking at how do these pleats come in. And so I was looking for ways to resolve this tension that I found, this space that was kind of a black hole between the closed square twist on one side of the paper and the closed square twist on the other in the square and triangle systems. And what I found were these cursed twists where the pleats aren't arranged so that you can make a closed square. They aren't arranged so that you can make an open square. They aren't arranged so you can make a closed square on the back side. And you end up with this shape that so let's get some mountains and valleys drawn on here, so we can make sure we've got everything in the same positions the whole time. So if I've got these valleys coming in, and I have these mountains, this is not going to produce a standard twist because the valleys and the mountains are both outlining the same square. And the normal way we would deal with this is by having this bit stand up at 90-degree angles. Pardon me while I get this in place. And we would have an interesting 3D structure instead of a flat folded shape. So typically we would resolve this something like this. And it really looks like you can't squash this shape. So notice I've got my folds in the mountains that are fully folded. I've got my valleys at 90 degrees, and I have valleys on both sides. So the floor will still stay flat. We get 180 degrees total valley. But this will not connect to other twists that are flat folded, and this is a problem. So what I do instead is I have these half of a closed square pre-creased along each mountain that comes in, and these half squares are centered on the corners of my central square. Effectively, these 4 pre-creased half squares are acting as rabbit ears. If you're familiar with the origami term, rabbit ear, to get extra paper out of the way so it doesn't run into everything else. Because you can see if I had the paper extending out along these mountains, when I then come to bring it together, it would be self-intersecting. And so I do these rabbit ears to get the paper out of the way and enable me to squash this twist flat. So we have this X shape on one side and precisely one grid square laid down in the same orientation that it was before. So it's not actually twisting. And that's another reason why I call this a cursed twist. So reason 1 is it requires pre-creasing, and I do twists so I don't need to pre-crease. And reason 2 is it doesn't actually twist. It's just coming down in place. The triangle shares those properties. It's not actually twisting, it's just coming down in place. and it shares the property of the rabbit ears that are the closed shape of the twist we want to make, centered around the points that we're outlining. And then once that's all pre-creased, we can fold it together and squash it all the way down. And you see, I needed precisely that amount of paper taken out of the way, because if I had any more paper sticking out in the middle here, it would be self-intersecting right now. So that's what these curse twists are. Now, let me show you why I use them. So first off, let's look at the closed square case, or rather the square case, and we'll see what we can do with this setup. So last week I was talking about extended square symmetries, and we were looking at the variety of things that you can do with these square twists and talking about them in terms of a number line. So my number line here actually goes closed square on the back, cursed square, closed square on the front, open square on the front, and we can keep that going as far as we want. We can like have more open squares on the back side here. We can have things further and further open over here. And so what this does for me and why I need this is if I want to put something in a position of fourfold rotational symmetry at the intersection of the pleats from these two hybrid square twists. So let's see what happens with each of these different square twists and see which one is actually in a position of fourfold rotational symmetry. So first, let's try this closed square on the back. If I stick it in the pattern here, I can see that I'm going to have lots of space on this side, not so much space on this side. These two, so I've got 3 spacings along the mountain here until I reach the valley of the next hybrid, and I would have 4 spacings in the other direction. This is not going to be fourfold rotationally symmetric. And by the way, this is what I use with that closed square on the back in a position of twofold rotational symmetry for my hybrid rosettes tessellation. So let's go ahead and put that on the paper. I'm going to open up my pleat overlap and stick my closed square twist on the back. I'm going to end up with kind of a sampler here of different options and get that squashed down nice and smooth. And I can see, okay, I've got 2 spaces to this slit, 3 spaces to this slit. This is definitely not fourfold rotationally symmetric. Okay, so that's one. Then let's see, so the cursed square is hard to put in, so we'll avoid it as long as possible. Let's see what happens if I put a closed square on the front over here. Well, what I end up with is, you can see I've got a tube pleat on one side and a spacing larger than tube on the other. That's not going to be fourfold rotationally symmetric either. And granted, these hybrid square twists are fourfold rotationally symmetric around this square. So the way that they're squashed isn't going to look fourfold rotationally symmetric around whatever is put here, regardless of what it is. But the pleats would be fourfold rotationally symmetric. So closed square on the front, definitely not. And if we try open square on the front, then we're actually going to get even further away from that fourfold rotational symmetry. Things are going to be very different on the two sides. And I can go ahead and put that in. And you can see that now we have an overlap with the hybrid square on one end of this open square and a massive gap on the other side. So we can really narrow it down. Whatever is going to give us a position of fourfold rotational symmetry is going to be halfway between this closed square and this closed square. And that's what we want to do. So we need to put a cursed square in this position. And since I'm doing this on the fly, I'm also going to do the pre-creasing on the fly, which is possible, but mildly annoying. And so the first thing that I do is identify which square is my target square. And I can do that because I've got the mountain and the valley, and the mountain and the valley down below. And I know that my target square is exactly between the mountain and the valley in each direction. So for my pre-creasing, I need to split the mountain where it'll hit one corner of my target square. And so I can do that here as well. And then bringing up my other two directions also, I'm going to need a mountain going what in my previous orientation was down, and a mountain going to the right. And if I was folding this for a display piece, I would definitely have pre-creased this in advance. But as you can see, you can get it to go in and work. And now you see I've got a space of one between these pleats, I've got a space of one between these pleats, and that can continue around. Now, as I mentioned before, these hybrid square twists had to squash in one way or the other, so even if both of these squares are in positions of fourfold rotational symmetry, the hybrid squares will be fourfold rotationally symmetric around one but not the other if you choose to squash them that way. Hybrid squares throw everything for a bit of a loop, but when you look at the back side, you will have fourfold rotational symmetry because you're just looking at the pleats. So I've got two spaces between the slit and the corner of my square, two spaces between the slit and the corner of my square in both of these situations. Now, one of the cool things about these these cursed square twists is you get to decide which side is front and which side is back. There's only one of these between the two closed squares, and so you can have it either way. So I could drag this guy over, and you can see, unlike the other twists that I dragged over, there's no overlap, there's no gaps. This just slots in, which is a good indication that it's a position of fourfold rotational symmetry. And I could choose to continue the pattern on out with this loop of 4 twists and get everything my heart desires. So I'm going to check for questions real quick and see. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Do drop those in the chat if you have them. And we'll move on to why I feel the need to fold anything with cursed triangle twists. So the triangle twist situation is a little more complicated to set up because I'm working with an extended symmetry on a hexagons and triangles six-fold tiling. I'll do a video on those in a couple weeks. And to set this up, I have a hexagon surrounded by closed triangles on the back, surrounded by open hexagons on the front. So in terms of my hexagons, I've shifted more front open. So the two directions on the number line of twists are front open and back open. And so I've shifted one front open. And let's say I want to put this hexagon in a position of twofold rotational symmetry instead of three. If it's threefold rotational symmetry, then I just continue with whatever triangle I used in the interior. But if I want it in a position of twofold rotational symmetry, then the next triangle out needs to be in a position of threefold rotational symmetry. And we can see if I make this into a closed triangle on the back. So I've got these set up as triangle wraps. If I make it into a closed triangle on the back, like so, then this triangle is not in a position of rotational symmetry. It has one spacing to this hexagon corner and two spacings to this hexagon corner. That's not going to be rotationally symmetric. And we can see this on the diagram as well. If I bring this triangle in right here, that is going to have two spacings to meet the hexagon here, three spacings to meet the hexagon here. These are one more than we saw in the physical paper because there's one spacing hidden underneath. And that's a tip for reading crease patterns. There's always one spacing hidden underneath the folds of a twist, unless you're talking about right triangles and some other special situations like double depth pleats. And so if it's not going to be the closed triangle on the back, let's see, maybe it's the open triangle on the back. We'll try going that direction. And so I'm going to match my sampler with my paper. And in order to get that open triangle on the back, I need to shift this pleat from the triangle wrap one over and squash that. Well, that's definitely not interacting with these two hexagons the same way. Most definitely not. It's right at the corner of one and two spacings from the corner of the other. So let's go the opposite direction. And we want to try to avoid using the cursed twists for right now. So let's start with the closed triangle on the front. I'll rotate it so it'll fit in this slot. And oh my, that does not look like it's going to work either. Definitely not threefold rotationally symmetric. And if I even try to do that with paper, I'm not sure that I'm going to get a good result. So I'm going to need to like fold through this hexagon to get that triangle in place. That's not threefold rotationally symmetric either. Okay, so what are my alternatives? Well, one thing to notice here is that the pleat for the closed triangle on the front is shifted over many spaces relative to the pleat for the closed triangle on the back. In fact, we can quantify this. I can see in here that the intersection of these two mountain folds from the two hexagons is right here. The intersection from the two valley folds would be over here. So this valley and this valley. And the valley fold here needs to go 1, 2, 3 spaces to line up with the intersection of valleys that we need to form a closed triangle twist on the back. So if we're not working with a closed triangle on the back, we're not working with a closed triangle on the front, and it takes 3 shifts to go between the two, that means there's 2 gap spaces in between. There's a cursed triangle on the back and a cursed triangle on the front. So let's grab, and here we run into questions of, does this cursed triangle work the same way as the cursed square, where it can be front or back with the same crease pattern? And in this case, they're actually distinct. So let's try one and then the other. I'm going to rotate this guy so it'll fit in the slot, and just make sure that everything's on the correct grid intersection. Looks like this one is not going to be 3-fold rotationally, bring it on screen. That one's not going to be 3-fold rotationally symmetric either. And I can tell because it's closer to one hexagon than it is to the other. But if I go and grab this one, now everything is evenly spaced from the 2 hexagons, and we are able to put this in a position of 3-fold rotational symmetry. So I'll fold this one first, because I can do that from this side. I'm going to be working off of this intersection, and I can read the crease pattern to see that I'm going to need my rabbit ears starting in this location, and then my rabbit ears for my next mountain are going to be out here, right up next to my hexagon twist. So that's always a sign when you're working with this stuff, whether you have rotational symmetry or not. If you do the 2 things coming off of the neighboring twists and they're not looking the same, then maybe try a different one if you're going for that rotational symmetry. And then we can twist it all closed. And this is getting pretty dense up under this hexagon. Then, last but not least, our cursed triangle that actually will form a position of 3-fold rotational symmetry here. I'm going to have these pleats splitting from the valley side. So I'm going to actually flip my paper over so I can better see what I'm working with and see if I can figure out where to make these splits. And it looks like this is going to be my central triangle. But appearances can be deceiving. Let's see if I can figure this out from the side where my crease pattern is, and you can start to see why I'm calling this cursed, because it is not playing nice. So working along my valley here from the hexagon twist, I get 2 spaces before this valley split. And so I'm going to bring my paper up like this, and then likewise along this valley up here, I'm going to go 2 spaces before my valleys split. And with those 2 in place, I should be able to find my 3rd direction and bring the target triangle up to the top. And this is definitely going to require flipping over to the other side to get everything nicely in place. Get these creases on my 3rd split in evenly. And you can see why I say that this should be pre-creased, because it's a royal pain to do it in real time. And so once I've got that cursed triangle set up, you can see these splits are interacting with the 2 neighboring hexagons in exactly the same way. And we end up with this grid triangle that's sitting exactly between these 2 hexagons. So this is going to need to be 3-fold rotationally symmetric, which means that the next hexagon is going to come exactly to this position. And from there, we can finish the rest of the tessellation. Now, again, I would recommend, if you're folding these twists, pre-crease them before you fold anything else. This is not easy. That's an understatement. But it does solve the problem. It solves the problem of being able to do whatever extension of symmetry I want on this tiling. And the key thing here is that since I shifted from closed hexagon to open hexagon, so more open front, 1 spacing open front direction for the hexagons, I also need to make that same shift for the triangles. So from closed triangle on the back, I go to cursed triangle on the back. And that is also a step, 1 step towards open front. And you could also think of it as a step away from open back. That pleat shift that I showed with the open back twist is the same shift in the opposite direction for getting this cursed back twist. And so that's the cursed triangle and square twists, and a little bit of explanation about the number line of twists that goes from open back to open front. And so now you've seen how these are useful in putting in twists in the chosen rotational symmetry, either 4-fold here or 3-fold here, and getting these patterns to work out the way that you want them to in these extended symmetries on common tilings. I'll be talking more about this, more about the number lines, about some other interactions where we have the hybrid twists that are actually in a 2-dimensional system, not just 1-dimensional on the number line. I'll be talking more about extended symmetries, more about options for other ways to use lots and lots of twists in advanced twist techniques. So advanced twist techniques is coming up on October 15th, and I will be teaching 3 lectures. I will have a special guest, Ben Parker, teaching another lecture. We're going to be covering everything from as I said, number lines of twists, hybrid twists. I'm going to be talking about mixed depth twists, where you have multiple pleat depths around the same twist. Then we'll be talking about a notation system for twists, notating the pleat locations so you don't have to remember, oh, this person uses the vocabulary of open and that person uses the vocabulary of spread. And you don't have to remember these vocabulary words for the different designers. You can just see where the pleats are and have a notation system for that. He's also going to talk about modifying twists, so back twisting and adding decorative elements to common twists. And then I'm going to finish up with a talk on, and I've got to check my notes, on these expanded symmetries and the design equation. So like I was talking about, when the hexagon goes one in the open direction, open front direction, then the triangle also goes one in the open front direction if you want this hexagon to be in a position of twofold rotational symmetry. Likewise, design equations for square tilings. There's just a lot to discuss. And so I hope that you will join me there. I'll drop a link in the description below for how to join, and hopefully I'll see you there. It's going to be a lot of information and a lot of crease patterns that you'll then be able to decipher using that information. So, like, I'm talking in the order of over 50 crease patterns that haven't really been published elsewhere. And so that's going to be a fun one to get your hands on. So I'll drop that link and see y'all later. Happy folding.